Welcome, friends. I'm excited to share the story of King David from the Bible and my drawings the past couple of weeks. I was inspired to share David's story because he was a man after God's heart. Although David sinned against God, he was still a good king. Before David, there was a king by the name of Saul. Saul started off as a good king and followed God, but not after long, Saul stopped listening to God. Saul was instructed to destroy everything after defeating the Amalekites. After defeating them, Saul took the people as slaves and cattle for sacrifices. He disobeyed the Lord. The prophet Samuel rebuked Saul and told him God would anoint a new king. The prophet Samuel came to the tribe of Judah to visit Jesse and his children. Samuel asked to see all the children one by one. After 7 boys, Samuel asked if there was another son. Jesse said there was David who was tending to his sheep. Samuel asked to see David. When he saw him, he said, "This is the one to be chosen." Samuel anointed David as God's chosen one to be the next king. Saul was now troubled with fear and depression. His son Jonathan knew about David's ability to play the kinnor or the harp. Jonathan and Saul's messengers went to find David. They brought him back to play the harp when King Saul was tormented. When David played the harp, Saul would feel better, so he asked David to stay. Saul's son Jonathan became friends with David. They trusted and would help each other. The Philistines were preparing for war against the Israelites. Their largest soldier named Goliath was a giant compared to any other Israel soldiers. Goliath challenged the best soldier of Israel to fight him. Everyone was afraid except David. David volunteered to fight Goliath. He told Saul and his people he was not afraid because he had killed a lion and a bear to save his sheep. The Israelites tried to give David armor, but it was too big and heavy, so instead he only took his slingshot. Goliath laughed and taunted him, but before he knew it, David slung a stone, hitting him straight in the forehead, causing him to fall to the ground. David took Goliath's sword and slew his head. David immediately became a hero. Saul was impressed with David, so he put him in charge of his army. David continued to gain popularity, causing Saul to grow jealous. Saul was so jealous he now tried to kill David by throwing a spear at him. David had to flee, and Saul began to continue to search to kill him. When Saul was searching the wilderness, he needed to take a break, so he stopped in a cave. David knew Saul was coming and had a chance to kill him. Instead, David cut part of his robe and showed Saul that he was not trying to overthrow him. Saul learns that Samuel had died and the Philistines were after him. Saul's army is defeated. Then Saul falls on his own sword. David laments the loss of Jonathan and Saul. David had now been on the run for almost a decade. After King David's death, Saul's 4th and only surviving son, Ishbaal, takes the reign of Israel. David becomes the king to the tribe of Judah at age 30. After civil wars and many years later, Ishbaal is assassinated. Then David becomes the king of all Israel. When David had become king, he built a palace in the city of David. He had the Ark of the Covenant moved to Jerusalem after it was built by Moses over 400 years ago. When David compared his palace to the temple, he didn't think it was right that it was the size of a tent. He wanted to build a larger, permanent temple. God told a prophet Nathan that David was not to build a temple because he had shed much blood. Nathan told David it would be his son Solomon to build the temple. God wanted a king of peace. One day, King David was on his balcony when he saw a beautiful woman. He had her brought to him and asked her name. She told David her name was Bathsheba, the wife to the soldier Uriah. David slept with Bathsheba despite that she was married. A couple of months later, Bathsheba became pregnant. David tried to hide his sin by sending Uriah to war and have him killed. The prophet Nathan told King David of his sin. David repented, but he suffered consequences. He would lose his son to Bathsheba, and his other sons would rebel against him. When David grew older, he learns one of his sons, Adonijah, is tempting to become king. Because the prophet Nathan told Solomon was to be king, Adonijah's plan was short-lived. David crowned Solomon as the next king of Israel. David died at the age of 70 after reigning for 40 years. I hope you enjoyed the story of King David. I was inspired how God never gave up on David and David continued to follow God despite his mistakes. I'm continuing to work on more characters in the Bible, so leave a suggestion if you have one, or leave a comment below. I hope to see you in the next video, and be well.